This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Fairy tales of horror. Dr. Judd Burton for our annual Halloween episode, straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. Spiritual warfare is where the rubber meets the road for us as Christians, but often we treat it as though it doesn't really exist. Well, during the month of November, we're tackling this subject head on as we celebrate the release of Sharon's new novel, The Poisoned Pawn, Book 8 in the Red Wing Saga, a series that teaches spiritual warfare through compelling stories featuring characters that you come to know and love. As part of this special package, we're offering the important new book by our friend Vicki Joy Anderson, They Only Come Out at Night, where she looks at the phenomenon of night terrors or sleep paralysis, examines what the medical community says about it, and then digs into the spiritual forces behind it. And the good news, that there is a way to make it stop. We're also offering our 2-disc DVD set, Unmasking the Ancient Gods, a series of presentations on spiritual warfare, everything from the UFO phenomenon to Jack the Ripper and spiritual warfare in the 19th century, which is really where the storyline of the Red Wing Saga begins. Bought separately, this package is worth $65, but it's yours for just $35 plus shipping and handling during the month of November only. Our spiritual warfare special offer, available only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. And as always, we thank you for your prayers and your support. Fairy tales aren't all Mother Goose and nursery rhymes. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Before we get to our guest this week, as we discuss fairy tales and how it connects to the genre of horror and modern tropes of Halloween, very quickly want to remind you to take advantage of our free app. Why? Because the gatekeepers of big tech may well yank this program, yank this channel with a moment's notice or without a moment's notice. We've had a couple of programs on this YouTube channel pulled over the last year or so for things either said or not said, but implied. And if we disappear without any warning, would like you to have a backup plan. If you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment, get our mobile app on your Roku, Apple TV, or your mobile device, whether it's iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire, phone, or tablet. We've got apps for all of those, gilberthouse.org/app, and it is free. Now, we're going to continue putting programs out here on YouTube because it's a 21st century Mars Hill. It's an opportunity to speak truth where people are. And we pray that people will find us. We ask you kindly to share the links around to these programs, those that you find helpful, useful, or what have you. But in case they take offense, case in point, 3 weeks ago, we got a strike against this channel, and an episode from January of 2021 was removed for a 10-second comment that I made in the back 5 minutes of the program. An hour and a half program. The last 5 minutes said something the censors didn't like. And we think back to January of 2021 and, what was going on then, so you can imagine what it is. Anyway, we've had, Skywatch TV had the entire channel nuked without any warning. And people are still trying to find Skywatch TV now on YouTube. Most of the programs are back up there. We tried to be cautious without censoring what we say as far as the truth goes. But just in case, please take a moment, get our app. Smartphone, tablet, Roku, Apple TV, gilberthouse.org. You'll find the link in the top menu bar. Now, what have fairy tales to do with Halloween? Joining us for what's become an annual tradition at this time of year, a gentleman who is the founder and senior fellow of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, and an expert on what we can roughly call monsterology. We welcome back to the program our good friend, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, welcome back. This is a kind of an annual tradition. I had to go back into the files. In fact, I'm going to have to put a link in the notes, the show notes after this, for people who want to go back and hear our previous programs. We've been doing this for, almost 10 years?
Yeah, I was going to say at least, I think the first one we did was 2009, actually.
Wow.
Maybe 2010.
9 or 10.
I think was the first.
I'll find the links and I'll put those in the notes because we covered a lot of subjects over the last decade, from werewolves and witches to vampires, golems, Frankenstein, and So in trying to come up with a new subject, Sharon, who has all the good ideas that come out of our house, suggested something that might be a little, I don't know, some people may not connect it to Halloween, but I thought interesting when you look at the history of where these stories come from, and this is right in your wheelhouse. So fairy tales. When we think of fairy tales, we think of Mother Goose and nursery rhymes and stories with happy endings, a fairy tale ending, fairy tale princesses. But these stories are actually a little darker than that, weren't they?
Yes, particularly when you consider the nature and the origins of the creatures that these tales take their name from. And that's probably the best place to start, is the actual etymology of the word fairy and what is a fairy. We have these ideas about fairies being what was our earlier conversation?
Well, you think Tinkerbell, right? I had a crush on her when I was a little kid, and we saw, Peter Pan, and it's quite a different impression that Disney has left us with than what the Celts had.
Right, exactly, and that's the world over is just that sort of generalized kind of. In reality, whitewashed version of what these things actually represented and what they were. Fairy has become a kind of generalized designation for a kind of mythological or preternatural creature that we often associate with a number of European mythological traditions, the Slavs, the Germanic tradition, that of Western Europe, and of course the British Isles. They all had fairly popularized fairy traditions within their respective mythologies and folklores, and it's just speaking in terms of anthropology. You find these kinds of entities all over the world, really, but they seem to be peculiarly fleshed out in the Indo-European traditions, going, in fact, all the way back to very old Persian tradition, the Avestan traditions. So even the ancient Near East had their own versions.
So we're talking going back into the pre-Christian era.
Yes, most decidedly so. And as we continue to sort of deconstruct the word itself and look at the etymology of fairy, the word can actually be traced back to a number of interesting cognate words. So we're talking about the same kind of idea, but interestingly enough, they all seem to be phonetically similar, although linguists have a hard time finding any sort of correlation in the historical linguistics of the word. But before we get lost in all that gobbledygook, the concept of the fairy, these sprightly kinds of preternatural creatures, which in some cases could be considered demoted older gods. With the Christianization of Europe, you started to see them depicted as demons and fallen angels. But actually, the word, probably the oldest word directly related to the Gaelic and English variations of fairy, are the Greek and Latin roots for the fates. The fata. There's that initial morpheme, the F and the vowel, that sort of gives us a little bit of connective tissue. But that to me was always an interesting part of the discussion of fairies, is their relation to, or at least in terms of the way that I suppose you might say the folklore taxon the way that it ended up in those languages was always interesting to me, as it was walked down through from a concept like the Fates. Who, if listeners are familiar with the Fates from Greek mythology, they weren't the impartial dispensers of natural justice that our sort of cartoonish depiction of them has made them out to be. These are some pretty rough customers, and that fits nicely with the fairy as more than just a trickster, but a malicious and mischievous trickster. A synonym for fairy is a sprite, and when we talk about sprightly behavior, if anybody uses such an anachronistic English designation anymore, that's a direct allusion to these kinds of entities, and sprightly being not only malicious, but often with the intent to sexually assault.
Like the succubus and incubus.
Unlike the succubus and incubus, exactly.
This sounds like the description that Amar Anus compiled in his really landmark paper about the Apkallu and the connections between the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, who were these sages who emerged from the Abzu, the abyss, to give the gifts of civilization to humanity, but were also tied with magic and could also be malevolent.
Yes. And I mean, very much so. I mean, as memory serves, Professor Anus is Estonian.
Yes,
I think
he is
by ethnicity, and so he's not only from his work in ancient Near Eastern texts, but from his own culture, he would have been familiar with the Slavic variations of these kinds of entities.
And that's relevant because the Apkallu, as he showed in that paper, were the watchers of Hebrew religious tradition. So suddenly now we're connecting the fairies and the sprites to the Apkallu and the watchers.
Well, I'm just getting started, Derek.
Oh, this is going to be good.
You asked for it, and I suppose we can partially blame Sharon, but in a good way.
Yeah, amen.
So, again, it's a very similar kind of thing that you run into like the vampire or the werewolf. We've talked about this before. They've gotten a gloss over. They're no longer the villains in pop culture. They're anti-heroes. At worst, and then they're just completely put up on a pedestal. On the other end of the spectrum. So in the same way that to truly understand the demonic spirit behind the vampire, you have to take away the cinematic and literary facade and the fake fangs and the cape and all that stuff. And you have to do a similar sort of thing with the whitewashing that fairies have gotten in not only Western tradition, but world tradition, because of course these tales and legends have been translated into, probably hundreds of languages at the very least. And as I said, just from an anthropological perspective, these sort of sprightly, mischievous creatures, haunt the mythologies of virtually all world cultures.
So how is it then they've managed to be rebranded or the image makeover over the last couple of centuries? Who's responsible for this?
Well, we can, I suppose one place where we could start when you had the Elizabethan Renaissance taking place in England, for instance. Arguably the greatest writer of the Renaissance, and certainly the late Renaissance period, William Shakespeare, is basically preserving a lot of this sort of English and Celtic lore. The play that pops to mind would be something like Midsummer Night's Dream, where the narrative arc is this this melodrama that's taking place in the fairy world and how it's intersecting with the affairs of humanity. And so there's a kind of literary trajectory. And in the ensuing centuries, you had writers from the British Isles, including England and Scotland and Ireland in particular. I'm thinking of William Butler Yeats and a number of his contemporaries that preserved a lot of this folklore, not only in kind of an ethnological fashion, but they preserved a lot of it, or sort of rebranded some of it in lyric poetry form. So it's, and now by the time we get to the modern age, you've got people who are popularizing in different ways, particularly when cinema in particular becomes part of this popularizing mechanism. You got people like, notably Walt Disney, who took, a lot of Grimm's work and just churned out these adaptations based largely on the work of these two German brothers who went around and collected the residues of Germanic myth and folklore.
Yeah, the Brothers Grimm, or who I was thinking of, I had not considered, and this is on me because Sharon brought up the name of Puck, who's the character in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's play that you mentioned earlier, and sort of a trickster character in that play. But I hadn't considered Shakespeare as a conduit for rehabilitating the image of these. When Shakespeare or the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century got hold of these tales, how did they change? What did they do to change the image of these sprites, fairies, or any of the other characters or tropes that we see in fairy tales?
Well, it was very, very typical of Renaissance era writers and later writers to be subject to the literary paradigms of the day. And one of the prevailing ones, not only in the Renaissance, but especially in later centuries, were the varieties of humanism that we saw prevalent in the Western world. And so the application of this humanism was to try and project human values and humanize the fairy folk, as it were, to make them more relatable. And so you don't want to talk about all the nasty, dark things that they do, right? In order to make them relatable, they start to get these literary and eventually cinematic makeovers.
So instead of being a malevolent creature who could really cause harm, Puck, for example, just changes the head of the character Bottom to that of a donkey or an ass.
Precisely,
which is bad enough.
There's this sort of whimsy that's attached to the malicious mischiefness that these things were known for in culture, particularly oral culture, is changed to a kind of play, if you will, a kind of lighthearted play, to where nobody's really hurt. But that's anathema to, particularly when you take these things back to their most ancient and prehistoric roots. That's really anathema to their entire personality.
They were then, and again, if we assume that the Apkallu of ancient Mesopotamia were the origin of this, clearly there was equating them with the Watchers of the Hebrew tradition. You're back to commingling with humanity and the evil that produced, but also the teaching of forbidden knowledge, which led to witchcraft and sorcery.
Well, certainly, and I suppose if we had enough time, we could probably do a whole series on the categories of fairies that we have. But I think we've done a pretty good job so far of building a kind of general character sketch, if you will, what fairies are. One of the emblematic fairies in Celtic tradition is the Banshee, which a lot of listeners will be familiar with, and this comes from the Gaelic word Banshee, which literally means maiden or lady or woman of the fairy mound. And of course, the Banshee was associated with in later years was associated. Well, I suppose you could say in her ancient roots too, was associated with a portent of death in the family. In more ancient tradition, the Banshee was associated with the reverence of ancestors in the various tumuli that you find in the British Isles. She's often associated with those locations and the communication of the dead, and also by proxy, she's associated with the traveling between these worlds. So there's this sort of portal element to the Banshee as well, and this concourse with the spirits of the dead and the old gods, is not terribly dissimilar to what you find in, say, the Witch of Endor. With her association with the ritual pits of the ancient Near East.
Yeah. And as we were talking just before we began recording, I'm working on our next book, and in that section right now, talking about these megalithic monuments to the dead, the dolmens, which comes from a Brittonic word that means table, because you find them all over Ireland, Scotland, and England. And so the British explorers in the 19th century who encountered them in the Jordan River Valley, like, oh yeah, we saw these back in Ireland. So you got these all over the planet. Korea's got a mess of dolmens. You find a bunch of them in the Caucasus Mountains too, which is interesting because that's close to the mountains of Ararat, but I digress.
Right.
So, but I was not aware that the Banshee was connected with this because, as you say, coming back to the point, this relates very much to the practice of ancestor worship that Sharon and I have been researching, documented to the Amorites and Canaanites who surrounded ancient Israel. Yeah,
precisely. When you dig through the mythological layers, what we're getting at here is essentially the same idea. It's the same activities, the same kinds of preternatural manifestations. But as I pointed out in any number of our discussions, they typically conform to, cultural details, cultural ensconcement, in other words.
They take on a form that's culturally relevant to the people who are hearing the story.
That's right, exactly, precisely. And this kind of cultural engineering, again, takes us to the summit of Mount Hermon, where all this begins. And I have discussed on linguistic bases, how this kind of cultural engineering happens. And really, I think I've just scratched the surface, just in terms of the language facet of this. But even that can be applied to what we're talking about tonight, because of the rough etymology that I just gave about the word itself. That it's a word that has ancient, if not prehistoric, roots, and is associated with the trafficking, as it were, with spirits. Be they again, the same motifs pop up again and again. If they're concoursing with spirits of the dead, who are likely these fallen gods, fallen entities that are masquerading as their god kings. Where have we seen that before?
Yeah.
That's straight out of Mesopotamia. It's straight out of ancient Anatolia. We see it all over the Levant. So that if I could get people to hone in on anything tonight, it would be that connective tissue. So the next time that you hear the word fairy or fairy tale, or think about something like the, like Snow White, or
fairy godmothers,
the fairy godmother, or the Pied Piper of Hamelin, or any of a myriad of fairy tales that we likely grew up with, there are these darker elements to them that often don't make it out into the disseminating process. In other words, they get this sort of literary, and in our age, cinematic and streaming whitewashing.
This is really intriguing because the idea of the fairy princess or the fairy godmother. I mean, I'm sure we'll see some this Halloween season, young ladies dressing up as fairy princesses, because you get this idyllic version or image of how innocent and pure and good, in the sense, I guess, of white magic. This is. Without this thought that there's somehow this can be connected back to this event that took place millennia ago that was so abhorrent to God that he took the angels that were part of it and basically has chained them in Tartarus, in the abyss, the bottomless pit, until Armageddon, when they get out for 5 months, right at the end of time. This is kind of startling, I think, for people to hear. But I guess it shouldn't be too surprising, because we've seen this kind of rebranding take place with, as you say, vampires and werewolves. We've even seen it with the Titans in recent years, where that term has been recycled in the Godzilla universe now. These monsters that are the colleagues of Godzilla are no longer monsters of unknown terrestrial origin or whatever. MUTO was the acronym. They've been rebranded as Titans in the Godzilla series, the original and rightful rulers of Earth. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
That's because that's who we're talking about here. The old gods of the Greeks, who were, according to the fake news version in Greek religion, they were sent to the netherworld by Zeus. The Hurrians had a version of that story where their old god Kronos and his colleagues, or not Kronos, but Kumarbi, were sent down by the equivalent of Zeus named Teshub and banished to the netherworld. The same story. I mean, even Enlil, who was the creator god of Mesopotamia, winds up in the netherworld as one of the judges of the netherworld when Marduk takes over. So this story, again, that's the fake news version to explain why the old gods who used to walk with humanity and show us all this really neat stuff are no longer with us. But these stories persist, even in the stories of like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, or Cinderella and her fairy godmother. It's this is kind of startling.
Yeah, well, I mean, and there are these even there have always been these sort of darker undertones. It's just it takes some digging on this side of history to pull them out, and although in recent decades there's been a lot of bad things that have come out of academia and traditions prior, we had tools presented to us by anthropologists like structuralism and mythological analysis, mythography, that have produced some really interesting results to tease out these darker undertones. I think J.P. Mallory and especially Marios Gimbutas that we were talking about earlier today before the show. Gimbutas in particular has done some really interesting work. I can't remember if she's still alive or not, but has done some really interesting work towards that, in looking at the darker undertones, using the same kind of structuralism that I mentioned a moment ago that anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss use to examine mythology, which really is designed to hone in on binary opposites in these stories. So if people are interested in that, I would highly recommend a research of some of these people that I've name dropped here because they've been influential in developing a lot of my own ideas. But yeah, it's really, really, if you even see some of the Disney adaptations of these old classics, those darker elements are certainly there. with the witch, offering the poisoned apple, and the sort of implied communication, or at least the love of the dead in Sleeping Beauty, where this prince falls in love with not literally dead, but the sleeping is symbolic of a kind of death.
Right.
So I mean, it's all there. It's sort of like, when we talk about bad translations of the Bible into English, you have to have half a dozen Bibles and commentaries to filter through all the bad translations so that we can actually get to the nuances of what the languages are saying. But it's there, hiding in plain sight. And even in the attempts to sort of make this material more appealing and digestible to wider audiences, you still tease out these darker elements that show you, after all, the rather, demonic origins of a lot of these stories and legends, that we're actually dealing with these kind of fallen entities that make up the basis of so many discussions involving the divine council worldview.
There are a lot of fairy tales that involve characters that are clearly evil, trolls and giants and witches and so forth. But you mentioned one that I want to touch on and just get your thoughts. That's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The pied referring to his multicolored dress, but in the story, most people have heard of it. The town of Hamelin, suffering a rat infestation, hires this piper who claims that he can play music so sweet all the rats will follow him, and they promise him 1,000 guilders or something, and he leads the rats away. They drown in a river, and he comes back to get paid, and the mayor tries to welch on the deal. And so he then pipes again and leads 1,300 children out of the town, and they're never seen again. And there are various versions of the story, but apparently, Judd, this is based on something. The earliest version of this, as far as I can find, goes back to the early 14th century. So this is long before the Brothers Grimm collected their stories in the early 19th century. This is really kind of a dark story. There's no happy ending here. The kids go away and they're either in a mountain, drowned in a river, or off to Transylvania. And there's no happiness story here. And apparently some historic event that inspired the story.
Yes, you mentioned that this takes us back to the 14th century, and of course that's smack dab in the outbreaks of the bubonic plague.
Sure, hence the rats.
Hence the rats, which carried the fleas that actually caused the disease. But this motif of actually absconding with loved ones or children after a deal, gone wrong, is again another theme that you find in various mythologies around the world. And in some cases, those things that abscond with the loved one or a child, as is often the case. A replacement or a changeling is often thought to have been put in place of them. But you're right. In a lot of ways, the Pied Piper character he represents this archetypal sprightliness that we associate with satyrs, right? He's musical. He's kind of whimsical. And what is he doing? He's stealing innocence. So again, you could even argue, if you peel back the layers of this onion, just from a mythographical standpoint or even an anthropological standpoint, that what you're looking at here is the taking of innocence, the stealing of innocence. So again, if you've got the right tools to sort of break down the basic elements of these stories, you can begin to see that they have these darker roots. And of course, the people in Germanic and Slavic regions in Europe had a menagerie of these kinds of creatures in their mythology that took children in the middle of the night. Again, even taking this back to the ancient Near East, the Lilith would have been one of these creatures that absconded with children, not only absconded with them, but consumed them, consumed their flesh and their blood as the queen of demons. And so, like I point out, with the proper tools, you can actually deconstruct these things and find the smiling demonic face behind all of it.
A Lilith mentioned in the Bible in Isaiah 38, or Isaiah 34 rather, although it's not usually translated that way. But that's that. In fact, that's the verse that Doug Van Dorn mentioned during our recent Iron and Myth discussion, with Isaiah 34 being translated so as to desupernaturalize it. The reference to the satyr or the goat demon, and the screech owl, which is actually the reference to Lilith in Scripture. I think I mentioned 1,300 children. I was confusing that with the date. That's the date of that stained glass window that was created on the church at Hamelin. But apparently there's a reference in a local chronicle dated to the year 1384 that says it was 130 children who apparently disappeared in the year 1284. So apparently this there's some evidence that this historically took place. But what exactly it was, we don't know. But the way the story is told, this Mary Piper who leads away the children, it almost sounds like Pan. Yeah.
Very much so. Like I say, the both the Germanic peoples and the Slavic peoples have variations of a Pan in their own mythologies. As I understand it, that church was destroyed at some point. If it's the same one that I'm thinking of, you're talking about the one that had the stained glass.
Correct. Yeah, it was destroyed in 1660. But a modern reconstruction, based on surviving descriptions, a modern reconstruction has been created by an historian. And the way the story goes, according to one account, is that there were 3 children who were left. One was lame, and so he couldn't walk out and follow the other children from the city. One was deaf, and so he couldn't hear the piper. And the third was blind and couldn't see where he was going. And they remained to tell the adults what had happened when they returned and found all their children missing. But apparently this chronicle from 1384 says it is 100 years since our children left, which is, that's really gruesome. Why would, when the Brothers Grimm collected these stories, these Germanic, Celtic, Nordic stories, and tried to clean them up a little bit to make them more palatable for, so sales would be better. This one would seem to be one that you would kind of leave out. Why was this cautionary, maybe a cautionary tale? Live up to your promises. Don't renege on your deals.
Yeah, well, these kinds of moral and philosophical underpinnings are not uncommon in these fairy tales and stories. There typically is some sort of moral that's being connoted. But just like with any myth, there's typically a nugget of truth, and not just philosophical truth, but historical truth. As you and I have been talking about now for over 10 years, that's really beyond debate, that there's this link between mythology and historicity. But it's undeniable that in Germanic tradition and the traditions of Central and Northern Europe, that there were these entities that absconded and took away children for various reasons. Gnomes were amongst the ones in Germanic tradition who would wait on the fringes of woods and try and lure children into the woods with their magic and candy and things like that. And that sort of moves us closer to stories like another famous Grimm tale, Hansel and Gretel. Where you have children being lured to their demise by this witch in the forest, who is kind of a known creature, in at least in terms of the mechanics of the tools she uses to lure these children into the woods. So yeah, there's clearly a very dark and demonic and folklorically and mythologically rooted element here. Another thing, Derek, that I thought would bear mention on in terms of relevance to our discussion today is King James's work on the subject of demons, demonology, which the audience is probably familiar with. If you're not, it was written in the reign of King James, and he himself, being a pretty devoted student of the Bible, wanted to satisfy some of these questions for himself. And the results of that research was this dissertation of sorts called Demonology. And he clearly explicates the connection between, again, here we've got somebody who's in a position to know these connections between what he's seeing and has grown up with in the lore of the British Isles and the biblical world. And he associates fairies en masse with various kinds of demons and fallen entities. So if people are looking for well, it's kind of not exactly the same thing, but it's roughly analogous to what you would have with the Hellenized rabbis in Alexandria translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the form of the Septuagint, with the proper Greek idioms to reflect the proper Hebrew idioms.
Mm-hmm.
You've got somebody who grew up in that culture and lore, and they're familiar with that, and they're also a devoted student of the Bible. So that would be one reason why I would point people to James's work on called Demonology, where he does, in fact, in some detail, work out the relationship between the ideas of the fairies and the British Isles and their true identities as these fallen entities.
That's interesting. Yeah, as you say, similar to the Septuagint translators rendering David's battles with the Philistines in the Valley of Rephaim as taking place in the Valley of the Titans.
Right.
People who are watching this on YouTube saw me smiling as you were discussing the story of Hansel and Gretel, and that's because there is an opera based on that, and we have a videotape somewhere of Sharon performing the role of the witch in that opera with crazy hair and just having a great time overacting the role and just kind of eating up the scenery, really having a fun time, knowing of course that the witch was going to be shoved into the oven at the end of the opera.
Right. Now, how is it that none of us have seen that yet, Derek?
Well, transferring from videotape to digital, it's just
right. Yeah, it's a nightmare.
I mean, there are other evil creatures in fairy tales, goblins and trolls, of course, and Tolkien did a wonderful job of transferring and sort of setting the genre, the fantasy genre, for the 20th and 21st century. I mean, fantasy fiction, fantasy film really owes a huge debt to Tolkien and his collation of those older stories. But elves in Tolkien, you've got the elves who are righteous and good, and sometimes aloof, not really wanting to deal with humans much. I mean, Thranduil comes to mind. We'll trade wine with Lake Town, but I don't want to go there, kind of thing. Right. But that's not really how elves were seen by the Celts and the Norse, was it?
No, not at all. In fact, they were considered to be as equally sprightly and mischievous as any other sort of fairy folk in those traditions. Whereas Tolkien took certain elements of elf kind and basically gave them I suppose you'd say a virtuous exterior, but he also doesn't neglect the other side of elf kind, which is the mythological folkloric kind from Germanic tradition, and that he posits that the orcs, which consequently are another of these fairy creatures from Germanic lore, he posits that the orcs are actually elves that are taken by Melkor, Morgoth, and twisted and malformed, so that they're originally elves, but they go through this sort of. I would say that the Nimrod transformation is probably accurately analogous here. They go through that kind of transition and become the orcs. So, although Tolkien does have races of elves that, of course, are virtuous and art-loving and all the things that we love about the Tolkien elves, he also retains the darker, more evil element of elf lore within the Germanic tradition. But they exhibit the same kind of malicious behavior that these other kinds of entities typically do in the folklores in mythologies of Europe that we're kind of focusing in on today. But really, again, the world over, you can find these same kinds of creatures.
They were depicted in one of the Thor movies. Was it Thor: The Dark World? The Dark Elves, led by Malekith, Christopher Eccleston, playing a really good role there. That's sort of the kind of thing that we're talking about here. These Dark Elves from the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
That is a more accurate. Interestingly enough, they did that while Stan Lee was still alive. By the way, but yeah, that's a more accurate depiction of what the elves were like in Germanic tradition.
So essentially, we're looking at fallen angels when it comes to the Dark Elves, or elves in general.
Or again, if we're talking about preternatural manifestations, they certainly could be demonic.
Okay.
So that those hierarchies are somewhat fluid in these traditions, and that's when I pointed people to James I work, Demonology.
What common threads or lessons can we take from fairy tales as Christians? I mean, other than just saying, okay, these are just stories and maybe they're morality tales in some cases, but are there any lessons, anything as far as our relationship to the spirit realm that we can take away from fairy tales?
Well, yeah, in that respect, a lot of the fairy tales that deal specifically and overtly with these kinds of creatures are cautionary tales not to traffic with them, not to have anything to do with them. And in that respect, if people are interpreting them in that manner, then they certainly bear similarity to the prescriptions against necromancy that you see in the Old Testament. We mentioned the Witch of Endor earlier, and these kinds of ambulatory, semi-professional priestesses that perform these kinds of necromantic rituals. And again, that is an archetype that you find the world over. What is it that, just in terms of the anthropological definition of witches, that's one of the things that they do is for a price they'll communicate with the dead or the supposedly dead. And at this time of the year, when we're thinking about the traditions associated with the original Halloween, Samhain, and the belief that the veil between this world and the next is the thinnest, and the communication of the dead is facilitated by that breaking down of the veil between the material and the spiritual worlds. For believers, that should be very much on our mind, just in terms of the time of the year and what has historically taken place, and remembering that, particularly with regard to the traditions of the British Isles, these very same fairy folk and tales that abound in those locations associated with them are directly related to the tradition of Halloween. And all the more reason for us, that's something that we learn from Scripture in terms of the proscription and why we shouldn't do it. but here are here illustrations within real cultures as to why we shouldn't do it.
And one of the things that startled me in the research for my most recent book, Second Coming of Saturn, because Sharon and I have been digging into this for a while, the thread of the Rephaim was just so interesting. We just had to keep pulling on it. And the more we pull on it, the more we see it's interconnected to so many other things, not just in Scripture, but in, well, all of human history. I mean, your paper on the morphemes, the phonemes behind the word Rephaim and connections to the words for royalty or regal in the Eurasian languages was just at the right time. I was able to include it in the book because it all fits together. The prohibitions against consulting with mediums and necromancers in Leviticus and Deuteronomy have a list of things that are prohibited, but in each case, those prohibitions are connected to sacrificing children to Molech. This consultation of the dead to try to get information from the spirit realm is connected everywhere in Scripture with the prohibition against the sacrifice of children. And then when you take that a step further and realize that Molech was just the name that the Hebrews applied to the Canaanite creator god El, who was Enlil, and take him all the way back, he's Shemiyaza, the leader of this rebellion on Mount Hermon. It comes back to your earlier statement that all of this can be traced back to that rebellion that took place on the summit of Mount Hermon. Exactly.
Yeah, and once again, what do we, in the case of the prohibitions against the practice of necromancy, the token of the people that believe this, in other words, the price that they thought that they had to pay was in blood to get this information from the other world, this favor from the other world. They had to be willing to, and actually in real time and space, sacrifice their children. Or here again, just as with these fairy creatures, you see the stealing of innocence, the taking of innocence.
Yep.
The kidnapping of children, the killing of children, the attempted murder of children. It all circles back to not just the Old Testament in general, but that pivotal moment, a pivotal series of events that began at Mount Hermon.
Well, that's a good place to wrap this episode of our annual Halloween discussions. And it's a bit surprising when you start from the image that we've been given, thanks to Disney and other depictions aimed at children of fairy godmothers and fairy princesses and so forth, of something, innocent and sweet and gentle and child safe and child friendly. And you take it back and suddenly it's like, wait a minute, child sacrifice and communing with the spirit realm in direct opposition to what God had decreed. A lot of Christian parents don't think that through. I certainly didn't when our daughter was young. So this is kind of where the theological rubber meets the road a little bit as parents, especially at this time of year where the kids want to dress up in these costumes that have these supernatural origins. And as Christians, we really have to wrestle with where we go and where we allow our children to go. And this is really a teaching opportunity, although it's one that the world is going to apply a lot of pressure to conform, because they don't want us thinking about this stuff. They want us to go along with it. The Day of the Dead in Mexico, that's just a cultural thing. Santa Muerte, it's a cultural thing. It's probably fine. Yeah. Not according to God. Judd, I know you're still working despite having, as you continue your physical rehabilitation, physical therapy. What can people find now available for study on issues like this at the Institute of Biblical Anthropology?
Well, I'm really excited. I've got an intern working with me now, and he has revamped the new website, which we're about ready to launch, and also the first series, the first program that we're offering is the completely revamped Preternatural Morphology, which is going to deal with a lot of the subject matter that we covered tonight. What I've what I've affectionately dubbed Monsters 101 is going to be the sort of flagship offering with the, we'll eventually be adding the other traditional programs as well. But people, if they're interested in that, they can get in touch with me at professorburton@yahoo.com. And the release of the long-awaited Van Helsing Way is just around the corner.
Oh, sweet. Sweet. Looking forward to that. We talked about that years ago, so I'm looking forward to reading that.
Yes, sir.
All right. Check the show notes for links, and we will link to both the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and Judd's personal website, burtonbeyond.com. Brother, always fun, and look forward to next month's Iron and Myth here on A View from the Bunker.
Indeed. Honored. Thank you, Derek.
In the show notes below, you'll find links to Judd's website, burtonbeyond.com, and also the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, TIOBA.org. And we got some exciting things coming up in 2023 that we're going to partner with Judd and Aaron Judkins for the research that they've been doing. So we're looking forward to that. We'll tell you more about that as we get closer to the end of the year and get ready to make the announcements about what exactly we're looking forward to doing in 2023. Going to be a busy year, and a couple of things to tell you about that relate to next year. Very quickly, we just came back, as I'm recording this now, on the evening of October 21st. We came back last weekend from a really, really wonderful weekend in Jeffersonville, Indiana, that is just across the river from Louisville, the Advanced Spiritual Warfare Training Workshop from Hear the Watchman. If you weren't there, and didn't have an opportunity to take advantage of the streaming video, I encourage you to keep an eye on the Hear the Watchman website, because they're taking the video of the presentations. They're taking the videos and editing them. They had multiple cameras in use, and they are now editing, doing post-production, incorporating our slides into the presentations, and then also using notes that we prepared for those presentations to put together essentially study guide for each of the presentations. Myself, David Hevner, Tom Dunn of Through the Black Ministries, Vicki Joy Anderson, a recent guest here on this program, about her book, They Only Come Out at Night, Sleep Paralysis, Night Terrors, and the Spiritual Forces Behind Them. And these will be made available into essentially a multimedia study guide for you, your Bible study class, what have you. And should be available within a couple of weeks of you seeing this video. So hearthewatchmen.com. Keep an eye on that, because the focus of the weekend was unique as far as Christian conferences go. And taking that information and turning it into a study guide, so the presentations with accompanying notes as a study guide, is really a kind of a unique thing. And we're hats off, or earbuds tipped, to Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore for thinking to put this together, and for Jim and Crystal Woodcock for doing all the work behind the scenes in preparing the video and the study notes. Coming up in March of next year, March of 2023, we're going to be back in Israel, God willing, March 19th through 30th, the scheduled dates, with an optional 3-day extension over to Jordan. And we encourage you to join us over there. Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat and his wife Lynn of Messiah of Israel Ministries, last week's guest in this program, Zev, will be with us as we take you around and show you the sites in Israel, not just as a tourist would, but to show you these spiritual battlegrounds from Eden to Armageddon, essentially. So not just what happened then, but what is going to happen and where it's going to happen. From the Mount of Olives, you will basically see the objective for the army of the Antichrist in the War of Armageddon. That would be the Temple Mount. So find out more online. We got 2 buses full already. We may add a 3rd, and we just ask you to pray about it. And if it's something that is of interest to you, you'll find the information at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Links there will take you to the Lipkin Tours website. There's an itinerary posted online, breakdown of cost, and of course a place to reserve your spot. But don't wait. Again, we got 2 full buses already. That's about 100 people. That's a good size. Enough of a crew to have a good time without being unmanageable when you get to these various sites. So find out more online, gilberthouse.org/travel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to listen or watch wherever you are consuming this podcast. If it's at YouTube, please subscribe, hit the button for notifications and share it around. If you're listening at Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are sold, again, I say thank you and remind you that our announcer is the inimitable D.C. Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We do this because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.